Ontario was the only province in Canada that requested a child that streamed kids into two different streams of learning, applied and academic. And I believe we should not be the outlier. We want to ensure that every single child, irrespective of their background, their ethnicity, their faith, that every child has an equal shot of succeeding. And I want children in Ontario, particularly racialized Black and underrepresented children, to know that we believe in them.
Ontario students entering high school next year will be the first to not choose between applied or academic courses. The option, known as streaming, is being phased out for grade 9 students.
Advocates say streaming divides students early on in high school, robs them of options, and disproportionately impacts racialized and low-income students. To discuss the curriculum change and the difference it will make, we welcome to CP24 tonight Carl James, a professor with the Faculty of Education at York University, and Kearie Daniel with the group Parents of Black Children. Thanks to both of you for joining us tonight. Professor, I want to start with you. Streaming was first introduced all those years ago as a means of creating options for students. It really had the opposite effect for sort of a segment of the population, a segment of the student population.
Yes, it was supposed to provide the option, but of course this is not just basically because of streaming, but because of the society in which we live and how we conceive of or think of the possibilities of the possible interests that students may have. And therefore, that operates into ways in which we've streamed them into particular paths towards education.
So curriculum's being created through a very specific lens. A white lens.
And if the curriculum doesn't include or seem not to be inclusive of the student that the teacher is teaching, and the student might find that curriculum or the material that the teacher is bringing doesn't address his or her needs and expectations, or even his or her their interests, then you could see why whether it's academic or advanced or applied, you can see why students would find that disenchanting.
Kearie, tell me about your reaction to today's announcement. I know it's something that parents of Black children have been calling for some time. You say streaming was discriminatory. Tell us why.
Yeah, we 100% agree with Dr. James. And, you know, streaming did not allow many students, particularly Black and racialized students, to see their full potential. You know, streaming was a process where you were asking kids as young as 12 and 13 years old to make decisions that would impact their future and the rest of their life. So there are a generation of students, of learners whose lives have been impacted by the fact that they were streamed into applied programming that limited their opportunity. So, you know, while this is a small step, the elimination of grade 9 streaming, it's a welcome step, but it does not go far enough. We want to see streaming eliminated in all its forms across all grades in Ontario's education system. We are the only province where this happens. We need to rip off the Band-Aid and we need to get rid of streaming, full stop.
Kearie, what do you think took so long? I mean, certainly the Ford government's taken this step today, but why didn't, you know, the previous Liberal government and all the governments before that, why didn't they do this? Yeah, you know, Black advocates, Black community members have been calling for the end to streaming for decades. This is not something that we can lay at the feet of you know, governments from just 10 years ago. This has been happening, and we've been asking for the end of streaming because we've been seeing the impact in our community for many, many decades. I think, you know, what we need now is to ensure that students are supported and that students are enabled to fulfill their full potential, and that educators can see the full potential of Black students and are not limiting them because of their own personal, you know, racism or bias.
Professor, you conducted some research on this back in 2017 and obviously in the years since. How did you go about determining you know, the impact, the negative impact that streaming has on racialized students, Indigenous students, and students from low-income families?
I've been observing this from the 1980s, where when I first started seeing and observing that Black students weren't really in academic programs and tended to be more streamed into applied. And of course, locally developed is what it's called today, or in that area where we think they will be going to work immediately after school. And so I haven't seen that over and over again and haven't seen any changes over all these years. Then I keep thinking about, well, when is it that we're going to start thinking that we have to start doing something different, something other than just simply thinking that a child can decide when he or she or they leave grade 8, what he or she or they want to do when they are finally out of school. You know, that's pretty early to be expecting students to determine. And it's not just the students, it's also the parents. The parents also have an idea, and also some parents might know about the different streams, some parents might not. And those who don't know will not be able to instruct their children. And of course, we think of how teachers and students also make these decisions again when they leave in grade 8. And I would assume that having removed the streaming from grade 9, we're going to take it right through, and therefore there would not be any streaming in any of the schools after this. But there's an important point to think about. When is school coming out of teachers, when there's a culture of streaming that all students, teachers, parents, everyone is so accustomed to, what would schooling look like without streaming? Yeah. Will streaming take a different form? That's one important question for us to think about and look at.
I was going to ask, how do you then, in the absence of streaming, what sort of model do you think would work that would allow students of different backgrounds, different strengths, of different learning styles to really flourish? How do you go about that throughout their high school career?
It would mean that we have to start thinking of the students and seeing the students' potential. And of course, you know, we can think of a student not barely reflective of what grade that they get in grade 8, to think that that grade 8 grade determines what he or she they will become later in life. No, that we can't do that. So it's going to be important for us to start thinking differently. And so there's going to be a need for teachers and everyone to do work about how we're going to do education differently, how we're going to think of students differently, because we have been trained, we have always been doing it in a particular way, and we can't do it in that way anymore. So there is going to be a lot of work. So while streaming as policy or on paper might be removed, we have to start thinking, how do we operationalize a non-streaming principle in our schools? And that's going to be some work.
Kearie, I'm curious. You know, we've been talking about generalities about how, you know, racialized communities have been negatively impacted by streaming. Tell us to what extent is this obtaining lower paying jobs is to the detriment of personal lives the older they get? Talk a bit about how they've been impacted by streaming.
Well, I think, you know, we know that your academic achievement and, you know, your outcomes are often tailored to your income, right? So if you're able to go on to university, if you're able to go on to get a diploma or degree, you have a higher likelihood of increasing your income and your stability as a family. So of course it impacts streaming. It has a direct correlation and direct impact into the lives of Black people. What we do know is that streaming for Black children in particular does not just start at grade 9. It happens as soon as they walk in the classroom in junior kindergarten, right? Whether they are put in particular reading groups, whether or not, how a teacher responds to a child who may not be working to the level that they should be at, whether that teacher is communicating with the parents, whether they decide to just let that child, you know, go with a failing grade, how they intervene and who they intervene with. All of these things are forms of streaming that we see in the elementary panel at school that then follows through into high school. So, Dr. Carl James mentioned locally developed, and one of the fears that we have is that children who may have been streamed into applied will now be streamed into this locally developed, which is even lower than applied because that actually hasn't been removed. Mm-hmm. So, when we say we need an end to streaming, we need an end to streaming in all of its forms. Black children are not faring well in our education system. They're just not. And this is a small step. It's a welcome step, but it is not enough.
In listening to you, sorry, go ahead, Doctor.
If I may add, though, I want to underscore the point that Kearie just made, is what happens in kindergarten when the child gets into class. Mm-hmm. So even though the discussion right now is about streaming in grade 9, but we have to start thinking about how we might change things when the child gets into the kindergarten class, and think about how we're not going to stream him, her, or they into a particular area, but into education and schooling that would be responsive to that child's needs and interests.
Yes, it seems to me in listening to you that this is a structural problem that is not just the curriculum and the idea of streaming, but also how children are being taught.
Yes, and it's also a societal issue as well, because our entire society, because we're accustomed to competition, we always construct some people more likely to do better than others. All those kind of things have been playing out in what eventually became streaming. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to do some work to rather rethink about how we're going to assess possibilities for people based on their race, ethnicity, gender, language skills, etc. All those are important. So it's going to be a whole societal change that we're going to have to bring about if we're going to get rid of streaming that's not streaming.
Yeah. A very important first step happening as of next year in September for grade 9 students anyway. Professor Carl James, Kearie Daniel, thanks so much for joining us on CP24 tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having us.